The language we use to describe the gods in the pagan community often differs from that used by scholars, and also often contradicts even within the communities that we deal with. Is the domain the physical space over which a god rules, or is it the area of human life over which they're said to govern, or is it just something you have to pick as a cleric before you can finish your character in D&D? Is an aspect just a description, or is it more specifically a subset of a domain, or is it just something that Carl Jung tossed out there to make all pagans feel crappy about believing in the gods? And how the Hades do epithets work? Let's take a look. Karate got a few huge thank yous this week. Child of Nyx got me Race and Ethnicity in the Classical World, which is an anthology collection of primary sources on the topic that'll come in all kinds of handy later for historical videos. Coyote picked up Minoan and Mycenaean religion and its survival in Greek religion. Spark Bomber picked up Prey and a Hunter, which is a book I've been chomping at the bit to get, given how often it's referenced in other monographs that I have. And finally, Sky the Blue picked up Cosmology and the Polis, which I'm also thrilled to dig into, along with Greek Gods Abroad, which will be essential when I start talking about historical syncretism. Thank you all so much for your donations. Describing the gods is at once deceptively simple and an invariably complex issue. How does one distill thousands of years of history, cult, mythology, and culture into simple descriptions that one can use in their daily practice? Well, the answer is you really can't, but you can try and subdivide some of those things into categories in order to process the information more easily. Most often, these categories are labeled as domains and aspects. We'll get to epithets later, as they're tied to domains and aspects in a way that I'm not going to be able to separate them fully enough to define epithets on their own. As per usual, I'm going to attempt to make this applicable to more faiths than just Hellenism, but some of these definitions and examples will fit Hellenism more closely than other faiths simply because I'm more experienced with it. I'm not going to claim that the definition for domain and aspect that I'll use in my content will map fully with terminology used by scholars either. More like for the video that I did on the definition of pagan, I'm simply trying to create a baseline for my own content, as well as for use in the wider community, so arguments over terms might get a little easier to settle, and we can get on with the business of actually discussing and venerating the gods we love so much, instead of shooting potshots at each other from across the room over disagreements in syntax. The grammar wars can and will be fought on another front, I assure you. It's okay to lay your weapons down on this one. We'll start with domain, which is going to be the broadest of the terms that we'll be discussing here today. Within Hellenism, domain has two really distinct meanings. The first is much simpler, and it's one of the three layers of reality, the three sons of Kronos, divided by lot after Zeus overthrew the Titans. Zeus through the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld. Platonism also uses domain to mean something completely different, but we're not discussing that definition here. The second is more commonly used in multi-faith pagan spaces, and has even been so widely recognized as to make Google searches about the gods difficult because game makers have integrated the term into their game systems. This definition casts domain similar to the Greek word timai, or honors, in that it's the areas of human life over which the gods have dominion. Now, keep in mind, the word time or timai has more meanings than just that, but when you're talking about the gods, that's usually what it means. In this case, Zeus's domains would include the weather, kingship, guest-host relations, justice and honor, the weather in general, and so much more. When someone claims that a god or goddess is the god of something, they're often talking about domains. Domains can be of limited usefulness when beginning the search for information about a god or trying to compare them cross-culturally, but they can also become limiting if you're not careful. Labeling Hades as a god of the underworld can risk ignoring his rulership over areas like wealth generation and the role he was said to play in agriculture. Likewise with Persephone and springtime, as well as the underworld, you can miss her role in marriage and interest in flowers. Domains can also become limiting if one attempts to cast the god into a stereotypical role because of the domain they rule over. I chose Hades and Persephone here for good reason. Some underworld deities have been cast in a very negative light, particularly in faiths with binary or trinary punishment and reward systems integrated into their afterlife beliefs. As I mentioned in my video on Hades, link in the iCard if you missed it, he's often cast as the villain and as jealous of his brothers in modern media because of the assumption that he must be evil because of his rulership over the domain of death. But this is the furthest thing from the truth. Though Homer cast him as afraid of Poseidon because of the earthquakes that threatened to expose his kingdom, we see nothing else in the mythos that would suggest even the slightest malevolence on the part of Hades. This risks straying into the realm of overcomparison between pantheons, especially those that were closely related in antiquity. As a hard polytheist, within my beliefs, Jupiter, Zeus, and Anubis and Thor are all radically different deities, yet all have lightning within their domains. It's easy to slip into archetypalism when dealing with the surface level of domains, but this ignores the rich vein of complexity that separates these deities from one another and ignores the radical differences between cultures that once worshipped them. It's important to recognize the nuance and not give too much over to the idea of a domain being the god's main purview, as it's easy to miss the smaller aspects of these themes the gods were said to play a role in. The gods are varied, multifaceted, complex beings with a rich history and a mythology that can't easily be summed up in a few words. The most egregious offender we have is the concept of the divine masculine and the divine feminine, specifically the and not just divine masculinity and femininity, but that's a topic for another video. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear me rage about that one. It's been a pet peeve for a long time. Finally, casting a segment of human experience as a god's domain can also ignore the contributions of other deities to that sphere of human experience. For example, in later antiquity, Hermes was said to be a god of the dead, Thanatos to escort the soul to Hades, Hypnos closed the eyes of the deceased for the final time, Gaia received the body into her embrace, and even Demeter would be honored in a chthonic aspect because of her role in decay. Stating that Hades and Persephone rule over the domain of death implied that they were the only gods that had death as a part of their timai, and that is simply not the case. Which is where we come to our second term, aspects. Aspects also have a twofold definition, but the more common and useful of the two is a particular portion of a domain over which a god rules. In the example I just gave, Hermes rules over the domain of transportation, travel, and trade, and one aspect of that rulership is escorting the souls of the dead to Charon for their final boat ride. More often than not, aspects of deities are portions of their larger domains that cross over into other deities' primary domains, such that most people would not recognize this portion as being part of a deity's purview in the first glance. It's important to remember that in antiquity, the majority of the population would not have had access to all of the stories that survive to today. They might have even had access to different ones that didn't survive that we don't even know about. The majority of the rites that would have been practiced in the stories would have been localized, and as such, someone in antiquity might not have recognized all the rich assortments of associations that we have today. It's easy to mourn what was lost to time and decay, but also living in modern times is a boon, as we have access to multiple eras and city-states worth of information and experiences regarding the gods we love. As such, these aspects might not even be recognized in every source because travel was expensive, and often those in various city-states would reference things they weren't familiar with as being done in the way of whatever city-state the practice originated from. Rather than seeing these differences as contradictions, they were accepted as the natural variants because geography was inherently tied to history and experience. Specific dames, or noble houses, had specific roles in various polis ceremonies, and different locations honored different gods for different mythological accomplishments that were said to have happened on the site or nearby. In my video on how to worship without physical offerings, link in the iCard if you missed it, I talked about the Homeric hymn to Demeter and how the Eleusinian mysteries get their origin story from it. The House of Eleusis honored Persephone and Hades in a very different way than the rest of Greece for this reason. This doesn't mean that aspects are somehow lesser than domains, though they're often treated as such. Rather, aspects are simply more specific, and thereby sometimes more useful than broader domains. If you're worried about your seed sprouting, pray to Demeter, but if you want to make sure the plants actually bloom, Persephone might be more appropriate. If you're trying to do well in commerce, that would be Hermes' domains, but specifically wealth accumulation itself falls under Hades' aspect. Aspects also often have particular epithets attached to them, and I can't talk about Hades and wealth without bringing up the epithet Pluton. Epithets are particular names used to ask for intervention within a god's particular domains and aspects. Sometimes they're a whole name unto themselves, such as Deo for Demeter or Pallas for Athena, or sometimes they're surnames, such as Zeus Xenios or Athena Ergane, which are Zeus of hospitality and Athena of the work, specifically referencing textile work like weaving. Let me know in the comments, by the way, if you guys would like me to do some god profiles where I talk about some of their epithets and the stories they come from in the description. Epithets were an essential part of the argument portion of many prayers, which I discussed in my video video on prayer and Hellenism, link in the iCard if you missed it. These were usually epithets that described a particular aspect or domain of the god, and often entreated the god to act on the person's behalf in that area. Sometimes these prayers included references to stories or plays from which the epithets were thought to originate, such as appealing to Deo, who gave the gift of farming to humans after Persephone returned for a better harvest, or praying to Athena, Xenia, who exacted revenge with Odysseus for help with a bad host. There were local epithets as well, used only in specific areas to refer to a god as being of that place. These were most often found in festivals referencing these places and documents referencing these festivals, as well as in stories dealing with the god's origins there. They also sometimes come up in histories compiled by traveling historians in later antiquity, where they discuss the differences between various local practices. Sometimes, the only way we know about particular domains or aspects comes from these epithets. Apollon's Mintheos, or Apollon of the Mice, is one such example. Scholars believe the epithet came from a story where Apollon might have chased the mice out of a city. It's the only way we really know that he had an association with mice and rats, which were typically not referenced a ton in Greek mythology, although their main predator, snakes, certainly were. So, now that you know what those terms mean, how can you use them? Well, epithets are self-explanatory. Once you learn of an epithet and research its history and symbolism, you can potentially work it into your prayers and offerings to a particular god or goddess to deepen your relationship with them. Domains and aspects can be useful in discussions with other pagans and in research when trying to summarize your knowledge about a god or goddess, so long as you don't allow your understanding of that deity to become limited to god of XYZ domain, and thereby let your relationship be limited entirely to that domain. The ancients prayed to multiple deities for multiple things, and sometimes they prayed to the deity they felt closest to for help with pressing problems rather than the one that most closely was associated with the domain or aspect they were dealing with, and that's okay. Much like you might have a friend who's a forensic expert that also enjoys gaming and might know a little about knitting, the gods have intersecting interests that you can call on them for in a time of need if it feels right. Learning more about the nuances of the deities that you worship can help deepen your relationship, but be careful not to become too rigid and only calling on deities for their domains and aspects. It's okay to ask for stuff outside of them when the need arises. The gods are bigger than us. Just because the ancients understood them in very specific ways doesn't mean that that might not have changed as the religion grew and evolved if it had been allowed to. Thank you so much for sticking through that. If you're new here, burn the subscribe button that the smoke might rise to the algorithm, and pray that the like might intervene in the domain of engagement. Drop down into the comments and let me know about any confusion you might have felt over these terms, or if you use different terms for these concepts, what they are and how you define them. Or just tell me that I'm actually wrong because Jung said so and he's the authority on aspects and archetypes, so meh, if that's your speed. Special thanks to my patrons. This is a vid that I was asked to do a while ago by one of you, and I am so sorry that it took me so long to get around to it. I know that as a specialty video, this might not get as much attention as my other content, and the income from you all helps ensure that I can still make videos like this, and not only have to do topics I know will get a lot of clicks for ad revenue. May the cycle of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.